The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of First National Bank as Sandra Williams stepped through the heavy glass doors. At 42, she carried herself with the quiet confidence that came from building a tech company from nothing into a $100 million enterprise. Her tailored navy suit was impeccable, her natural hair styled in an elegant twist, and her leather briefcase contained documents that would change her company's future forever. Sandra had scheduled this meeting weeks ago. After 15 years of banking with smaller institutions, her company, Tech Forward Solutions, had finally reached the size where they needed the services only a major bank could provide. The acquisition of 3 smaller companies had pushed their valuation past the $100 million mark, and they needed sophisticated financial instruments to manage their rapid expansion. The lobby buzzed with typical Monday morning activity. Customers stood in neat lines while tellers processed transactions behind bulletproof glass. Sandra approached the information desk where a young woman with blonde hair and bright pink lipstick looked up from her computer screen. "Good morning. I have an appointment with Mr. Peterson at 9:30, Sandra said, checking her watch. She was exactly on time, as always. The receptionist's eyes swept over Sandra from head to toe, taking in her appearance with barely concealed surprise. "Mr. Peterson? Are you sure you have the right bank?" Sandra felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with these moments. She had experienced them countless times throughout her career, but they never got easier. "Yes, I'm Sandra Williams, CEO of Tech Forward Solutions. I have a 9:30 appointment to discuss business banking services." The receptionist's fingers clicked across her keyboard with unnecessary force. "I don't see any Sandra Williams on Mr. Peterson's calendar. Are you perhaps here to open a personal checking account? Our customer service representatives can help you with that." "No, I specifically need to speak with Mr. Peterson about corporate banking. Perhaps you could call his office?" Sandra's voice remained steady, though she felt her patience beginning to thin. "Look, Mr. Peterson only meets with serious business clients. Maybe you should start with a smaller bank that's more suitable for your needs." The receptionist's smile was sharp and dismissive. Sandra pulled out her phone and scrolled to her emails. "Here's the confirmation email from Mr. Peterson's assistant. The meeting was scheduled for today at 9:30 to discuss our company's banking needs." The receptionist barely glanced at the phone. "Anyone can fake an email. I'm going to have to ask you to leave before I call security." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Sandra felt every eye in the lobby turn toward them. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as customers and employees alike focused on the unfolding drama. She could feel the familiar burn of humiliation rising in her cheeks, but she had learned long ago not to let it show. "I understand there may be some confusion," Sandra said, her voice carrying the authority she had developed in countless boardrooms. "Perhaps you could simply call Mr. Peterson's office to verify." "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the desk. Mr. Peterson doesn't meet with people who just walk in off the street." The receptionist's voice had risen, drawing even more attention. An older security guard appeared at Sandra's elbow. His uniform was crisp, his expression apologetic but firm. "Miss, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Sandra looked around the lobby. Every face stared back at her with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. Some customers had pulled out their phones, clearly recording what they assumed was a woman being rightfully ejected from a bank she didn't belong in. The humiliation was complete and public. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Sandra said, but she could feel the futility of the situation. No amount of explanation would change what had already happened. "Ma'am, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be," the security guard said, his hand hovering near the radio on his belt. Sandra straightened her shoulders and walked toward the exit with her head held high. Behind her, she could hear the receptionist's voice, loud enough for everyone to hear. Some people really think they can just walk into any bank and demand to see the vice president. The nerve of some people. Outside on the sidewalk, Sandra stood in the morning sunshine and felt the full weight of what had just occurred. She had been refused service, humiliated, and ejected from a bank where she had intended to deposit millions of dollars. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 6 months ago, Forbes had featured her on their cover as one of the most innovative young CEOs in America. Her company employed over 300 people and had contracts with some of the biggest corporations in the country. She pulled out her phone and dialed her assistant. "Marcus, I need you to cancel the Peterson meeting and set up a conference call with our board of directors for this afternoon. Also, please send me all the documentation we have on our relationship with First National Bank." As she ended the call, Sandra made a decision that would change everything. She had spent her entire career proving herself in rooms where she was the only person who looked like her. She had smiled through condescending comments, worked twice as hard for half the recognition, and built her success despite countless obstacles. But this morning had been different. This morning, she had been denied basic respect and service, not because of any failing on her part, but because someone had looked at her and decided she didn't belong. Sandra Williams had spent years building power, influence, and connections. Now, it was time to use them. She walked to her car, started the engine, and began making phone calls. The first was to her lawyer, the second to her public relations team, and the third to her old friend David Chen, who happened to be the CEO of First National Bank's parent company. David had been her study partner at Harvard Business School, and they had maintained their friendship through the years. "David, it's Sandra. I need to tell you about something that just happened at one of your branches." Her voice was calm, but David had known her long enough to hear the steel beneath the surface. As she drove back to her office, Sandra began to formulate a plan. She had always believed in using her platform responsibly, in being the change she wanted to see in corporate America. Today had reminded her why that mission was so important. But more than that, it had shown her that sometimes the only way to create change was to exercise the power you had worked so hard to build. The young receptionist at First National Bank had no idea that the woman she had just humiliated controlled a $100 million company with influence that extended far beyond the tech industry. She didn't know that Sandra Williams sat on 3 different boards, had direct relationships with major media outlets, and commanded respect from some of the most powerful people in business. But she was about to find out. Within 30 minutes of Sandra's phone call, David Chen was sitting in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the First National Bank headquarters, staring at his computer screen in disbelief. The morning had started like any other, with quarterly reports and budget meetings. Now he was watching security footage that made his stomach turn. The video showed everything clearly. Sandra Williams, professionally dressed and carrying herself with obvious confidence, approaching the information desk. The receptionist's dismissive body language. The gradual escalation as more bank employees became involved. The public humiliation as Sandra was escorted out while other customers recorded the incident on their phones. David had known Sandra for over 20 years. He had watched her build her company from a small startup in her garage to one of the most successful tech firms in the country. He had seen her speak at conferences, had read about her innovations in business journals, and had personally recommended her for the Forbes cover story. The idea that someone had looked at this accomplished woman and seen only someone who didn't belong was both infuriating and heartbreaking. His assistant knocked on the door and entered without waiting for a response. "Mr. Chen, I have the branch manager from the downtown location on line 3. He says it's urgent." "Put him through," David said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Mr. Chen, this is Robert Martinez at the downtown branch. I think we may have a serious problem. I just got a call from my staff about an incident this morning. And now there are reporters outside the building asking questions about discrimination. David closed his eyes. Tell me exactly what happened, Robert. The branch manager's voice was strained as he recounted the morning's events from his staff's perspective. He painted a picture of a confused situation where a woman had become aggressive when asked to provide proper identification and had threatened the employees before being asked to leave. That's not what the security footage shows, Robert, David said quietly. I want you to pull every employee who was involved in this incident off the floor immediately, and I want you to review that footage yourself before you say another word about what happened. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. Sir, are you saying you've already reviewed the incident? I'm saying that Sandra Williams is not just any customer, Robert. She's the CEO of Tech Forward Solutions, she's a personal friend of mine, and she was there for a scheduled meeting to discuss moving her $100 million company's banking relationship to us. And your staff treated her like she was trying to cash a stolen check. David could hear the sharp intake of breath from the branch manager. Oh my God. Mr. Chen, I had no idea. The staff said she seemed confused about where she was supposed to be, and when they asked for identification, they never asked for identification, Robert. They told her she didn't belong there and had security escort her out. I've seen the footage. While David was dealing with the immediate crisis, Sandra was orchestrating a response that would send shockwaves through the banking industry. Her public relations team had already drafted a statement, and her legal team was reviewing every aspect of the morning's incident. But Sandra's most powerful move was happening behind the scenes. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since she had reached out to her network. The tech industry was smaller than people realized, and news of what had happened was spreading through CEO circles like wildfire. Michael Rodriguez, CEO of Data Vision Systems and Sandra's biggest client, called within an hour. Sandra, I just heard what happened. This is absolutely unacceptable. We're moving our accounts out of First National today. Similar calls came from other business leaders, board members, and influential figures who had worked with Sandra over the years. Each one expressed outrage and offered support. More importantly, several controlled significant banking relationships that could be moved at a moment's notice. Sandra's assistant, Marcus, knocked on her office door. The reporter from Channel 7 is here for the interview, and the producer from the Business Hour wants to know if you can do a live segment at 5 o'clock. Sandra had decided early in her career that she would use her platform to highlight important issues, even when it was uncomfortable. This morning's incident wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about every person of color who had been judged, dismissed, or discriminated against based on someone else's assumptions about where they belonged. The afternoon news interview was measured and professional. Sandra described the morning's events without emotion, let the facts speak for themselves, and focused on the broader implications of what had happened. She didn't attack the bank or call for boycotts. She simply told her story and let viewers draw their own conclusions. But the real impact was happening on social media. The hashtag Black CEO Bank incident was trending within hours. Other successful people of color began sharing their own stories of discrimination and bias. The conversation expanded beyond banking to include every industry where assumptions about race and class influenced how people were treated. Back at First National Bank, David Chen was watching his company's reputation crumble in real time. The bank's stock price had dropped 3% in the afternoon trading session. Customer service was flooded with calls from angry customers threatening to close their accounts. The board of directors had called an emergency meeting for the following morning. Robert Martinez, the branch manager, sat in his office reviewing the security footage for the third time. Each viewing made the situation look worse. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. His staff had profiled a customer based on her race and treated her with disrespect and discrimination. The fact that she turned out to be one of the most successful CEOs in the city only amplified the embarrassment. The receptionist, whose name was Jennifer Walsh, had been suspended pending a full investigation. The security guard was also on administrative leave. The other employees who had witnessed the incident without intervening were all facing disciplinary action. But the damage was spreading beyond the individuals involved. Corporate clients were beginning to ask questions about the bank's policies and training programs. Several major accounts had already indicated they were reviewing their banking relationships. By 5 o'clock, Sandra's live television appearance on the business hour had been watched by millions of viewers. Her composed demeanor and articulate explanation of the morning's events stood in stark contrast to the bank's fumbling attempts to manage the crisis. The host asked pointed questions about discrimination in banking, and Sandra answered them with the expertise of someone who had spent decades navigating bias in corporate America. "The truth is," Sandra said during the interview, "this morning was particularly painful because it reminded me that no matter how much success you achieve, no matter how much you contribute to your community, some people will always look at you and see only what they expect to see." The interviewer leaned forward. "What do you think needs to change?" "Institutions have to do better. They have to train their employees, examine their policies, and create accountability for discrimination. But more than that, they have to understand that diversity isn't just about being fair. It's about being smart. When you judge people based on assumptions instead of facts, you miss opportunities." This morning, First National Bank lost the chance to work with a $100 million company because their staff couldn't see past their own biases. As the interview concluded, Sandra felt a mixture of exhaustion and determination. The day had been emotionally draining, but she knew that her response would have consequences far beyond her personal situation. Sometimes change required more than just success and hard work. Sometimes it required using your platform to shine a light on problems that others preferred to ignore. Meanwhile, David Chen was preparing for what he knew would be the most difficult conversation of his professional career. He had to call an emergency meeting of the senior leadership team and figure out how to repair the damage that had been done not just to Sandra, but to his bank's reputation and values. The young receptionist who had started this crisis was about to learn that actions have consequences, and that the woman she had dismissed so casually possessed more power than she could have ever imagined. The emergency board meeting at First National Bank began at 7 o'clock the next morning. David Chen entered the mahogany-paneled conference room to find 12 of the most powerful people in banking waiting for answers. The mood was grim, and the numbers were devastating. Overnight, the story had exploded across national media. Major news networks had picked up the incident, business journals were running analyses of discrimination in banking, and social media was driving a conversation that showed no signs of slowing down. The bank's stock had continued to fall in after-hours trading, and preliminary reports suggested that customer inquiries about account closures had increased by 400%. "David, explain to us how a $100 million prospect was thrown out of one of our branches," said Margaret Williams, the board chairwoman. Her voice carried the weight of 40 years in banking, and her expression suggested that heads were about to roll. David opened his laptop and projected the security footage onto the large screen at the front of the room. The board watched in silence as the morning's events played out in real time. When it ended, the room remained quiet for nearly a full minute. "This is indefensible," said Thomas Bradley, the bank's largest shareholder. "How do we have employees who think it's acceptable to treat any customer this way, much less someone of Sandra Williams' stature?" The question hung in the air because everyone in the room knew the answer. The bank, like many established financial institutions, had failed to adequately address the unconscious biases that led to exactly this kind of incident. They had diversity training programs and written policies, but they had never created the kind of accountability that would prevent discrimination from happening. David took a deep breath. "I've known Sandra Williams for 20 years. She's one of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country, and she was prepared to move her entire company's banking relationship to us. Instead, we humiliated her in front of a room full of customers, and then had her escorted out by security. "What's our exposure here?" asked the bank's general counsel. "Are we looking at a lawsuit?" "We're looking at something much worse than a lawsuit," David replied. "We're looking at a complete loss of credibility in the business community. Sandra's company alone represents $100 million in potential business, but the real cost is the message this sends about who we are as an institution." While the board meeting was taking place, Sandra was in her own office preparing for the day ahead. The response to her story had been overwhelming. Her assistant had fielded calls from reporters, business leaders, civil rights organizations, and customers of First National Bank who wanted to express their support. But the most meaningful response had come from other entrepreneurs and executives who had experienced similar treatment. Their stories filled her inbox. A Latino tech founder who had been questioned about whether he was in the right building when he arrived for a board meeting. An Asian American CEO who had been asked if she was someone's assistant when she attended a conference as a keynote speaker. A Native American business owner who had been followed by security in an upscale department store while shopping for a client gift. Each story reinforced Sandra's belief that her experience wasn't isolated or unusual. It was part of a pattern of bias that successful people of color faced regularly, often in situations where their credentials and accomplishments should have made discrimination impossible. Marcus appeared in her doorway with a concerned expression. "Sandra, David Chen is on line 1. He says it's urgent." Sandra picked up the phone, curious about what her old friend would say in the wake of the crisis his bank was facing. "Sandra, I owe you the biggest apology of my professional career," David began without preamble. "What happened yesterday was completely unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the culture that allowed it to happen. I appreciate that, David, but an apology doesn't fix what happened. Your staff looked at me and decided I didn't belong there before I even opened my mouth. That's not a training problem. That's a values problem. You're absolutely right, and that's why I'm calling. I want to do more than just apologize. I want to make this right, and I want to make sure it never happens again." Sandra listened as David outlined his plan. The downtown branch would be temporarily closed for a complete retraining of all staff. The employees involved in the incident would be terminated. The bank would implement new policies and accountability measures designed to prevent discrimination. They would also make a significant donation to organizations working on racial equity in business. "That's a good start, David, but it's not enough. You're treating this like it was an isolated incident involving a few bad employees. But the truth is, your bank has a systemic problem, and cosmetic changes won't fix it." David was quiet for a moment. "What would you suggest?" "Fire everyone who was involved. Not just the receptionist and the security guard, but every manager who created a culture where this was acceptable. Then bring in new leadership who understand that diversity isn't just a policy statement. It's a business imperative." The conversation lasted for over an hour. When it ended, David knew that Sandra was right. The bank needed more than policy changes and sensitivity training. It needed a fundamental transformation in how it operated and who it served. By noon, the news broke that First National Bank had fired the entire management team at the downtown branch. Jennifer Walsh, the receptionist, was terminated for cause. Robert Martinez, the branch manager, was also let go, along with 2 assistant managers who had been present during the incident but failed to intervene. The security guard was released from his contract, but Sandra's most significant victory came in the form of a phone call from the bank's board of directors. They wanted to offer her more than just an apology and a banking relationship. They wanted her to join their board and help them restructure their approach to diversity and inclusion. "Ms. Williams, we realize that we can't undo what happened yesterday," said Margaret Williams during the call. "But we can learn from it. We'd like to invite you to consider joining our board of directors and helping us become the kind of institution that serves all customers with respect and dignity." Sandra was quiet for a long moment. The offer was significant. Board positions at major banks came with substantial compensation and real influence over corporate policy. More importantly, it would give her the power to create systemic change from within one of the country's largest financial institutions. "I'll consider your offer," she said finally. "But I want to be clear about something. If I join your board, I won't be a token appointment or a public relations gesture. I'll expect real authority to implement changes that address the root causes of what happened yesterday." "That's exactly what we're hoping for," Margaret replied. The news of Sandra's potential board appointment broke that afternoon, and it changed the narrative around the entire incident. Instead of just being a story about discrimination, it became a story about accountability, change, and the power of using your platform to create meaningful reform. The young receptionist who had started the crisis learned about the board appointment from the news, along with everyone else. She was packing her personal belongings from her desk when she saw Sandra's face on the television in the bank's waiting area. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. The woman she had dismissed as someone who didn't belong was now positioned to help run the entire institution. 3 months later, Sandra accepted the board position and began implementing sweeping changes to the bank's policies and culture. The incident that had started with discrimination and humiliation had transformed into an opportunity to create systemic change that would affect thousands of employees and millions of customers. The downtown branch reopened with new management, comprehensive bias training for all staff, and policies that made discrimination a firing offense. Customer satisfaction scores improved dramatically, and the branch began attracting a more diverse clientele that reflected the city's demographics. Sandra never forgot the feeling of being judged and dismissed based on someone else's assumptions about who she was and where she belonged. But she also never forgot the power that came with using her platform to create change. The young receptionist had thought she was protecting the bank from an undesirable customer. Instead, she had created the catalyst for transformation that made the institution stronger, more inclusive, and more successful than it had ever been. Sometimes the most profound changes come from the most painful experiences. Sandra Williams had turned her moment of humiliation into a force for institutional reform, proving that real power isn't just about building success for yourself. It's about using that success to open doors for others and create a world where everyone is judged by their character and capabilities rather than by someone else's prejudices and assumptions.